The crimson dawn of June 4, 1942, painted the Pacific horizon like spilled blood across silk. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he gazed toward the distant atoll of Midway. Behind him, the most powerful naval strike force Japan had ever assembled cut through the morning swells. For aircraft carriers to battleships, 3 cruisers and 11 destroyers, all bearing the weight of the Emperor's ambitions, the plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's masterpiece. Conceived in the shadows of Pearl Harbor's success 6 months prior, Operation Mu would deliver the knockout blow to American naval power in the Pacific, drawing out the remnants of the United States Pacific Fleet for total annihilation. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans had only 2 carriers in the region, making the Japanese advantage overwhelming with their fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, the architect of Pearl Harbor's aerial assault, prepared his aircrews with the same meticulous precision that had brought such devastating success to Hawaii. His pilots, veterans of countless victories across the Pacific, carried themselves with the quiet confidence of the invincible. They had swept aside British, Dutch, and American forces from Wake Island to the Dutch East Indies. Midway would be another stepping stone toward the complete domination of the Pacific Ocean. Below deck on the Akagi, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga reviewed flight plans with his squadron commanders. The morning's first strike would pummel Midway's defenses into submission, clearing the way for the invasion force following behind. His Cake torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers would rain destruction upon the American installations while Zero fighters swept enemy aircraft from the skies. It was a formula that had worked flawlessly throughout the Pacific campaign. The task force had maintained radio silence for days, believing their approach remained undetected. Japanese intelligence had assured Admiral Nagumo that American codebreakers had not penetrated their naval communications. This confidence permeated every level of command, from the admiral's planning strategy in the operations rooms to the mechanics preparing aircraft. On the hangar decks, the rising sun had never known defeat in naval combat, and today would cement Japanese supremacy across the vast Pacific theater. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive history of United States naval operations in World War II, the Japanese fleet's confidence was built upon an unbroken string of victories that had established their naval aviation as the world's finest fighting force. Yet 300 miles northeast, Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned his own forces with deadly precision. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, accompanied by the hastily repaired Yorktown, lurked beyond the horizon with their own squadrons of Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo planes, and Wildcat fighters. American codebreakers had achieved what the Japanese believed impossible. They had cracked the enemy's naval code and knew exactly when and where the attack would come. The stage was set for the most decisive naval battle in Pacific history. Neither side fully comprehended that the events of the next few hours would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the war. The crimson sky that morning would prove prophetic, for before the sun set on June 4th, the Pacific would run red with the blood of warriors, and the myth of Japanese invincibility would shatter like cherry blossoms in a typhoon. The first radar contact appeared on American screens at 5:53 in the morning, June 4th, 1942, on Midway Atoll. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon's voice crackled across the airwaves as he scrambled every available aircraft into the dawn sky. The Japanese had been spotted 150 miles out, their formation dark against the morning clouds like a plague of locusts approaching harvest fields. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the carrier Enterprise, received the contact report with grim satisfaction. His intelligence officers had predicted this moment with startling accuracy. Thanks to the heroic work of Commander Joseph Rochefort's cryptanalysis team at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were walking into a carefully prepared trap, though success was far from guaranteed against such overwhelming enemy strength. On Midway itself, Captain Simard's defenders prepared for the onslaught. Marine Fighting Squadron 121, equipped with obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, climbed desperately toward the incoming Japanese strike. Major Floyd Parks knew his pilots faced impossible odds. Their aircraft were outclassed by the nimble Japanese Zeros in every category of performance. Yet they climbed anyway, determined to exact whatever price they could from the enemy. The Japanese first strike, led by Lieutenant Tomonaga, consisted of 36 Kate bombers, 36 Valdive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. They approached Midway in perfect formation, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that echoed across the Pacific swells. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying, the concentrated aerial might of the Japanese Empire descending upon a tiny speck of coral and sand. The first interception occurred at 6:20 in the morning. Marine Captain John Carey's Buffalo fighters dove into the Japanese formation. With desperate courage, their machine guns blazing streams of tracer fire, the Zeros responded with lethal efficiency, their experienced pilots weaving through the American interceptors like deadly dancers. Within minutes, the sky filled with burning aircraft and parachutes, most bearing the star insignia of the United States. Below on Midway, anti-aircraft gunners opened fire. As the Japanese bombers began their attack runs, the atoll's defenders had prepared as best they could, dispersing aircraft and equipment, reinforcing bunkers, and positioning their few precious radar sets. Black puffs of flak burst among the diving vols, but veteran Japanese pilots pressed their attacks home with characteristic precision. Lieutenant Tomonaga's bombers methodically worked over the air, field, their explosions sending geysers of sand and coral high into the tropical air. Fuel dumps erupted in towering fireballs, while hangars collapsed under the weight of falling bombs. Yet even as destruction rained down, American aircraft continued taking off from the damaged runways, their crews determined to strike back at the Japanese fleet. The most significant moment came when Major Lofton Henderson's Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 spotted the enemy carriers. Henderson, flying an obsolete Vindicator dive bomber, led his squadron in a desperate attack against Admiral Nagumo's task force. His aircraft, affectionately nicknamed Wind Indicators for their poor performance, struggled to reach attack altitude against determined Zero opposition. As referenced in Gordon Prange's definitive work Miracle at Midway, Henderson's attack, though unsuccessful in scoring hits, marked the beginning of continuous American pressure that would prove crucial to the day's outcome. The Marine Major's aircraft took a fatal hit during his bombing run, but his sacrifice inspired others. Wave after wave of American bombers, Army B-26s, Navy Avengers, Marine Dauntlesses pressed attacks against the Japanese fleet throughout the morning hours. Though most were shot down or failed to score hits, they accomplished something far more valuable than immediate damage. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced the most critical decision of his naval career. At 7:15 on the morning of June 4, 1942, standing in Akagi's operations room, surrounded by charts and communication equipment, he contemplated intelligence reports that painted an increasingly complex picture of American resistance. The morning strike on Midway had achieved only partial success, and Lieutenant Tomonaga's radio message requesting a second attack created an operational nightmare. The Admiral's dilemma was brutal in its simplicity. His aircraft carriers held two types of ordnance: armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking enemy ships, and high-explosive bombs for land targets. Tomonaga's request meant reconfiguring his remaining aircraft for a second strike against Midway's installations, requiring dangerous and time-consuming ordnance changes. In the carrier's cramped hangar decks below, Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's brilliant air operations officer, argued for maintaining the anti-ship configuration. Intelligence suggested American naval forces might be operating in the area, though their exact location remained unknown. Changing ordnance would leave the Japanese fleet vulnerable during the critical hours when aircraft sat defenseless in the hangar bays, their weapons systems exposed and dangerous. The decision became more urgent as American bombers continued attacking throughout the morning. Major Henderson's Marines had been followed by Army Air Force B-26 flying at wave-top level, then Navy Avengers making desperate torpedo runs against the Japanese carriers. Though none scored hits, their persistence suggested a coordinated defense that exceeded pre-battle intelligence estimates. At 7:45, Nagumo made his fateful choice. Despite Genda's reservations, he ordered the ordnance change across all four carriers. Japanese deck crews began the laborious process of removing armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, replacing them with high-explosive ordnance better suited for attacking land installations. The work proceeded with characteristic Japanese efficiency, but it would require nearly 2 hours to complete. The Tone's reconnaissance aircraft, launched late due to mechanical problems, provided the first concrete evidence of American naval presence. At 7:28, the pilot reported sighting 10 enemy surface ships bearing north-northeast of the Japanese fleet. The message sent shock waves through Nagumo's staff, but crucial details were missing. Ship types, course, and speed remained unknown. Commander Genda immediately grasped the implications. If American carriers lurked beyond the horizon, the Japanese fleet was approaching the most dangerous moment in naval aviation. Caught with aircraft rearming below decks, while enemy strike forces potentially approached for attack, he urged immediate suspension of the ordnance change and preparation for anti-ship operations. Nagumo's response revealed the pressure crushing down upon him. His first strike aircraft, returning from Midway, were running low on fuel and needed immediate recovery. The morning's defensive battles had cost precious aviation gasoline and ordnance. His ships had been under intermittent attack for hours, straining crews and equipment. The admiral needed time to reorganize his forces, but time was the one commodity the battle would not provide. The critical message arrived at 8:09 in the morning. Tone's reconnaissance pilot radioed, "Enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier, bringing up the rear." The words transformed the tactical situation completely. American naval aviation was within striking distance, and Nagumo's carriers were caught in their most vulnerable configuration. As documented in Mitsuo Fukuda's post-war memoir, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, this moment represented the turning point, where Japanese tactical flexibility became a fatal liability. Rather than an asset, the admiral's second fateful decision followed quickly. He ordered another ordnance change, this time back to anti-ship configuration. Japanese deck crews, already exhausted from the morning's work, began the dangerous process of switching ordnance yet again. Armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes emerged from storage while high-explosive weapons went below. The work would take another hour at minimum, leaving the Japanese fleet exposed during the most critical phase of the battle. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey banked his dauntless dive bomber through scattered clouds at 14,000 feet, his eyes scanning the empty Pacific below for signs of the Japanese fleet. Leading 37 aircraft from the Enterprise, he faced a navigator's nightmare. His original target coordinates had revealed nothing but vacant ocean, and fuel gauges showed his squadron approaching the point of no return. The American strike plan launched at 7 o'clock that morning from Admiral Spruance's Task Force 16, represented the largest coordinated naval aviation attack in United States history. Enterprise and Hornet had launched everything flyable, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, all converging on the suspected location of Admiral Nagumo's carrier force. Yet as McCluskey's fuel needles dropped toward critical levels, the Pacific remained frustratingly empty. Behind McCluskey, his pilots maintained tight formation despite growing anxiety about their fuel situation. Ensign George Gay, flying with Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, had already watched his squadron mates disappear into the distance, following incorrect vectors that would lead them away from the enemy. The coordination between American strike groups was breaking down, threatening to waste the precious advantage gained through code-breaking intelligence. The Japanese fleet, meanwhile, struggled with its own coordination problems. Admiral Nagumo's carriers had successfully recovered their Midway strike aircraft, but the ordnance changes had created chaos on the hangar decks aboard Akagi. Commander Genda watched with growing alarm as deck crews worked frantically to prepare a strike against the newly discovered American carriers. Time was slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8, had made his own navigation decision. ignoring the prescribed flight plan. He led his 15 Devastator torpedo bombers on a direct course toward where he believed the Japan East Fleet was operating. His instincts, honed through years of naval flying, told him the enemy lay southwest of the original coordinates. At 9:20 in the morning, Waldron's gamble paid off. His radioman spotted smoke on the horizon, then the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese warships arranged in defensive formation. Four aircraft carriers steamed in the center, surrounded by their screening vessels like a steel constellation against the blue Pacific. The sight represented both triumph and terror for the American aircrews. They had found their target, but the odds against survival were astronomical. Waldron's attack began at 9:25. His torpedo bombers skimming the wavetops in the face of murderous Japanese fire. Zero fighters dove from above, while anti-aircraft guns filled the air with deadly bursts. The Devastators, obsolete and slow, proved helpless against such overwhelming opposition. One by one, they fell into the Pacific, their crews lost in explosions of spray and flame. Ensign George Gay watched his squadron mates die around him as he pressed his attack toward the carrier Kaga. His aircraft, riddled with bullets and losing power, struggled to maintain altitude long enough to drop its torpedo. The weapon splashed into the sea, running true toward the Japanese carrier before passing harmlessly beneath its keel. Gay's Devastator crashed moments later, leaving him floating alone in enemy waters as the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. The sacrifice of Waldron's squadron, followed quickly by similar disasters befalling torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown, seemed to confirm Japanese tactical superiority. Admiral Nagumo's Zero fighters had achieved complete air superiority over the fleet, shooting down American attackers with methodical precision. Victory appeared within grasp as the Japanese carriers prepared to launch their own strike against the discovered American forces. As recorded in Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, the destruction of American torpedo squadrons created a false sense of security among Japanese commanders that would prove fatal within minutes. Yet the torpedo attacks had achieved something far more valuable than hits on enemy ships. They had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches temporarily undefended. Japanese fighter controllers, focused on the low-level torpedo threats, failed to maintain adequate coverage above 20,000 feet. McCluskey's persistence was about to pay dividends beyond his wildest expectations. At 10:22 in the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted the white wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward across the Pacific swells. The vessel was moving at maximum speed, clearly attempting to rejoin some larger formation beyond the horizon. McCluskey made the decision that would change naval history. He followed that wake toward its destination. Within minutes, the most powerful naval formation in Japanese history spread out below McCluskey's dive bombers. Like a detailed model on blue silk, four aircraft carriers steamed in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. Escort vessels surrounded them in precise geometric patterns, their anti-aircraft guns already beginning to elevate toward the approaching American aircraft. The sight that greeted McCluskey's pilots was both magnificent and terrible. The carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the finest achievements of Japanese naval engineering, each capable of launching devastating air strikes that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. Their flight decks bore the scars of morning operations, fuel lines snaked across wooden planking, while ordnance carts positioned bombs and torpedoes beside waiting aircraft. McCluskey's tactical decision demonstrated the experience that made him one of the Navy's finest squadron commanders. Rather than attack the nearest target, he divided his force for maximum effect. His own squadron would strike the flagship Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best's Enterprise bombers attacked Akagi. Simultaneously, the coordinated assault would overwhelm Japanese defensive capabilities. Through sheer concentration of firepower, the Japanese fleet's vulnerability was complete, but invisible to its defenders. Zero fighters, drawn down to sea level by the morning's torpedo attacks, were climbing frantically to intercept the high-altitude dive bombers. Anti-aircraft gunners, their weapons designed primarily for low-level threats, struggled to track targets approaching from nearly vertical angles. Most critically, the carrier's flight decks were crowded with fuel lines, ordnance, and aircraft, a perfect target for high-explosive attack. Best's attack on Akagi began at 10:26, his dauntless bombers screaming down through scattered clouds toward the Japanese flagship. Admiral Nagumo's staff officers, gathered in the carrier's bridge structure, looked up in horror as American dive bombers materialized from the morning sky like avenging angels. The first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck near the island's superstructure, its explosion sending shock waves throughout the massive vessel. The second hit proved even more devastating. Best's bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar, where aircraft armed with torpedoes and bombs awaited launch. The resulting secondary explosions transformed Akagi from a proud warship into a floating inferno. Aviation gasoline fed the flames while ordnance detonations shook the carrier's hull. Like earthquake tremors. Simultaneously, McCluskey's squadron was delivering equally devastating punishment to the carrier Kaga. Multiple bomb hits set the vessel ablaze from bow to stern, her flight deck buckling under the force of internal explosions. Captain Jisaku Okada, commanding the carrier, watched helplessly as his ship was transformed into a floating funeral pyre for nearly 2,000 officers and men. The attack on Soryu came from an unexpected direction. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading bombers from the carrier Yorktown, had arrived independently of the Enterprise squadrons. His approach from the northeast caught Japanese defenders completely off guard, their attention focused on McCluskey's aircraft approaching. From the south, Leslie's bombs struck Soryu with devastating accuracy, igniting fuel and ordnance throughout the carrier's hangar spaces. As documented in Jonathan Parshall's authoritative study Shattered Sword, the concentration of 3 American dive bomber attacks within a 6-minute period represented one of the most decisive tactical achievements in naval history. Within 10 minutes, 3 of Japan's fleet carriers were burning wrecks, their crews fighting desperately to control fires fed by aviation gasoline and exploding ordnance. The carefully planned Japanese offensive had been shattered by precision bombing that destroyed months of operational preparation in mere minutes. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag from the burning Akagi, surveyed the catastrophe with growing disbelief. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated the Indian Ocean were dying before his eyes, taking with them Japan's most experienced naval aviators and aircraft maintenance crews. Only Hiryu remained operational, her captain already preparing a desperate counterstrike against the American fleet responsible for this unprecedented disaster. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on Hiryu's bridge at 11:13 in the morning, watching columns of black smoke rise from his sister carriers like funeral pyres against the tropical sky. The veteran naval officer had served the emperor for 23 years, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the sight of Japan's premier naval striking force reduced to burning hulks. Within minutes of perfectly executed American attacks, Hiryu, positioned several miles north of her sister carriers during the morning's operations, had escaped the devastating dive bomber attacks that crippled Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Her survival made her the sole remaining operational carrier in Admiral Nagumo's once mighty task force, carrying the entire burden of Japanese naval aviation on her flight deck. Kaku understood that his ship's next actions would determine whether the disaster could be transformed into tactical stalemate or complete catastrophe. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi prepared his 18-val dive bombers with grim determination, knowing his strike represented Japan's only hope for evening the tactical balance. His pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and countless Pacific victories, showed no sign of the shock that gripped other elements of the fleet. They understood their duty with samurai clarity: locate and destroy the American carriers responsible for the morning's devastation, regardless of personal survival. The strike launched at 11:55, climbing into scattered clouds that offered concealment from American fighter patrols. Kobayashi's navigation was flawless, leading his formation directly toward Task Force 17, where the carrier Yorktown steamed with her screening vessels. Intelligence reports suggested this was the smallest of 3 American carrier groups, making it the most vulnerable target for Hiryu's limited striking power. Yorktown's radar operators detected the incoming Japanese aircraft at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, providing crucial minutes for defensive preparation. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered general quarters, while his fighter controllers vectored Wildcat interceptors toward the approaching threat. The carrier's anti-aircraft crews manned their stations with practiced efficiency, knowing their ship faced its greatest test since the Battle of the Coral Sea 1 month earlier. The Japanese attack began at 12:40, Kobayashi's dive bombers, screaming down through intense anti-aircraft fire toward Yorktown's flight deck. American gunners filled the sky with tracers and shell bursts, their fire claiming several Japanese aircraft before they could complete their attack runs. Yet veteran Japanese pilots pressed through the defensive barrage with characteristic determination, their bombs striking the American carrier with devastating accuracy. 3 direct hits transformed Yorktown from an efficient fighting unit into a damaged vessel, struggling for survival. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck near the island's superstructure, exploding in the hangar space below and igniting aviation gasoline stored for aircraft operations. Fires spread rapidly through the carrier's interior while damage control. Parties fought to contain the growing conflagration. The second hit proved even more serious, striking near the ship's uptakes and disrupting steam generation for propulsion. Yorktown's speed dropped from 30 knots to barely 6 as her engineering crews worked frantically to restore power to the massive vessel, dead in the water and burning. The carrier appeared doomed to the same fate that had befallen 3 Japanese carriers that morning. Yet American damage control techniques, developed through months of intensive training, proved superior to their Japanese counterparts. Captain Buckmaster's crews contained the fires through systematic flooding and compartmentalization, while engineering personnel restored partial power within 2 hours of the attack. By early afternoon, Yorktown was making 20 knots and preparing to resume flight operations. As chronicled in Robert Leckie's comprehensive The Wars of America, Yorktown's survival demonstrated American naval architecture's emphasis on damage control capabilities that would prove crucial throughout the Pacific War. Hiryu's second strike, launched at 1:30 in the afternoon, consisted of 10 Kate torpedo bombers led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway. His aircraft approached Yorktown at wave-top level, their torpedoes aimed at the carrier's vulnerable hull below the waterline. The attack achieved complete surprise, American fighters being occupied with high-altitude threats to torpedo hits sealed Yorktown's fate, her hull flooding despite heroic efforts by damage control teams. The carrier's list increased steadily as Captain Buckmaster reluctantly ordered abandonment, watching his ship settle by the bow while destroyer escorts rescued survivors. From the Pacific swells, Tomonaga's aircraft, damaged during the morning's operations, crashed into the sea after completing its attack run, taking Japan's most experienced torpedo squadron commander with it into the depths. The sun hung low over the Pacific as Admiral Spruance faced the most critical decision of his naval career. Intelligence reports confirmed that 1 Japanese carrier remained operational, hidden somewhere beyond the horizon with unknown striking capability. His own forces had been reduced by Yorktown's loss, leaving Enterprise and Hornet to carry the burden of finishing what had become the most decisive naval battle in American history. At 4:30 in the afternoon of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson led Enterprise's remaining dive bombers toward the coordinates, where reconnaissance aircraft had spotted Hiryu steaming alone among her escorts. The Japanese carrier represented the last vestige of Admiral Yamamoto's grand strategy, her destruction or survival determining whether Midway would be remembered as American triumph or costly stalemate. Captain Tomio Kaku watched the approaching American aircraft with stoic acceptance of his ship's fate. Hiryu had launched her final strike hours earlier, expending her last operational aircraft in the unsuccessful attack on Yorktown. His flight decks were empty, his hangars cleared of everything except maintenance equipment and spare parts. The carrier that had helped devastate Pearl Harbor would make her final battle without the protection of her own aviation. Dickinson's attack commenced at 5:03 in the afternoon. 24 dauntless dive bombers screaming down through moderate anti-aircraft fire toward Hiryu's flight deck. The Japanese carrier's gunners fought with desperate courage, their weapons claiming several American aircraft before they could release their ordnance. Yet the mathematics of aerial warfare favored the attackers. Too many bombers approached from too many angles for effective defense. The first bomb hit Hiryu forward of her island's superstructure, its explosion penetrating the flight deck and igniting fuel lines in the hangar below. Secondary fires spread rapidly through the carrier's interior as aviation gasoline fed flames that reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Captain Kaku's damage control teams fought the spreading conflagration with traditional Japanese determination, but their efforts proved futile against such overwhelming destruction. Additional hits sealed the carrier's fate, each explosion adding to the inferno consuming Hiryu from within. By 6 o'clock, the last operational Japanese carrier was a floating funeral pyre, her captain preparing for the final act of naval samurai tradition. Kaku would go down with his ship rather than face the dishonor of survival, while his men perished in the flames. Admiral Nagumo, watching from the cruiser Nagara as his fourth carrier burned beyond salvation, contemplated the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen the combined fleet. In one day of fighting, Japan had lost for irreplaceable aircraft carriers, hundreds of veteran pilots, and thousands of experienced maintenance personnel. The naval aviation force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months lay scattered across the ocean floor. The implications extended far beyond immediate tactical losses. Japan's industrial capacity could eventually replace the sunken carriers, but the human losses were irreplaceable. Veteran pilots like Lieutenant Commander Fukuda required years to train and months of combat experience to achieve their lethal efficiency. The maintenance crews who kept aircraft operational represented accumulated expertise that could not be quickly reproduced in wartime training programs. More critically, the myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered completely. For 6 months, Allied forces throughout the Pacific had retreated before the seemingly unstoppable advance of Japanese arms. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, Dutch East Indies, Singapore. Each victory had reinforced the belief that Japanese naval aviation was tactically superior to any potential opposition. Midway proved that superior intelligence, tactical coordination, and individual courage could overcome numerical disadvantage. As documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's official naval history, the Battle of Midway marked the turning point where American industrial capacity and tactical innovation began their systematic reversal of Japanese Pacific conquests. The battle's final phase came at dawn on June 5, when Admiral Yamamoto reluctantly ordered withdrawal of the remaining Japanese forces. The combined fleet, reduced to battleships and cruisers without air cover, faced annihilation if American carriers caught them within striking range. The invasion of Midway was abandoned, along with broader strategic objectives that had driven Japanese expansion since Pearl Harbor. As crimson sunset painted the Pacific horizon on June 4, 1942, the rising sun of Japanese naval supremacy was setting forever. The blood-red skies that had witnessed the destruction of irreplaceable aircraft carriers would haunt Japanese strategic planning for the remainder of the war. From Guadalcanal to the Philippine Sea, from Light Gulf to Okinawa, Japanese naval aviation would never again achieve the tactical dominance that had characterized the first 6 months of Pacific War. The morale of the Japanese Navy, built upon centuries of victory and honor, had suffered wounds that would never fully heal. The warriors who survived Midway carried with them the knowledge that American naval aviation had achieved technological and tactical parity with their own forces. Future battles would be fought not with the confidence of the invincible, but with the desperate courage of those who knew defeat was possible. The skies over Midway had indeed turned blood red on June 4, 1942, but the blood that stained those tropical waters belonged not to American defenders, but to the cream of Japanese naval aviation. The rising sun would continue to fly over the combined fleet for 3 more years, but it would never again shine with the brightness that had illuminated Japanese victories, from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean in the depths of the Pacific. For aircraft carriers rested as monuments to the folly of underestimating American resolve and the decisive nature of naval aviation in modern warfare.